Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading out into the middle of nowhere for another collection of truly terrifying scary stories. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My family, my grandpa, grandma, mum, 2 aunts and uncle went on a camping trip out near Elephant Boot Lake in New Mexico. This would have been in the early 60s. At the time, the kids ranged from about 1 to 13 years old. My oldest aunt was the eldest, my uncle was around 11, and my mum was around 7. My youngest aunt was still a baby, and my grandparents were in their 30s. They were travelling and camping in a Volkswagen bus, one of the camper models which they used regularly for trips like this. My grandfather was a very experienced outdoorsman, having grown up in rural Illinois during the Depression. He knew how to handle himself, and taking the family out into remote areas was nothing new to him. Everything about the day followed the usual pattern, right up until the evening, when my grandfather went out alone on a fishing trip, but did not return. By 9 p.m. it was now fully dark, pitch black. Bear in mind they're out in the middle of nowhere, so there's no ambient light or nearby towns, just pure darkness. And of course, that's when the concern sets in. Because my grandfather was not someone who ran late, especially not without saying something first. According to my uncle and oldest aunt, my grandmother decided the best place to start looking would be the dock. That made sense. If something happened, that would be where most likely he'd be. So she loaded everyone into the bus and started driving along the road that circled the lake. At one point, without realizing it, she took a wrong turn. After about 15 minutes of driving, my youngest aunt started fussing in the back. My grandmother pulled off to the side of the road to tend to her. While she was doing that, my mum, uncle, and oldest aunt were looking out of the window trying to get their bearings. That's when my uncle noticed something was off. They couldn't see the lake anymore. By then, my grandfather had settled the baby and got back into the driver's seat, realizing something wasn't right. She decided to turn the bus around. She began a 3-point turn on the narrow road, trying to carefully reposition the vehicle. As soon as she started the engine again, the 3 oldest kids suddenly noticed movement outside. There were hundreds of rabbits just pouring across the ground, running fast and low, all moving in the same direction. They were coming from the left side of the road, the direction that was about to come into view as the bus turned. This wasn't normal behavior. As my grandmother completed the first part of the turn and shifted into reverse, she realized she couldn't back up. There was a ditch behind them, about 3 to 4 feet deep. Then she checked forward. Same thing, another ditch. Somehow they were stuck in place. She was certain she had put the bus in park before getting out earlier, but now they were positioned in a way that didn't make sense. It was at that moment they saw the light. Off in the distance, a red light appeared low to the ground, with rabbits still scattering away from it. The light then changed to white, and then back to red, sweeping slowly back and forth. At first, she thought it must be my grandfather. He had a signaling light that he used sometimes. But as they watched, something suddenly slammed into the hood of the bus with enough force to shake the entire vehicle. It was at that moment an intense white light flooded the inside of the bus, completely overwhelming everything. And after that, nothing. Back at the campsite, my grandfather didn't return until around midnight. He had run into an old friend while out on the water and ended up staying much later than he intended. When he got back, his family was gone and immediately went to the ranger station to report it. A search was organized, and given the terrain and lake nearby, they were already prepared for the possibility that the vehicle had gone off the road and into the water. They were discussing dredging or sending divers out. But that's when someone spotted the bus, which was sitting on an old service road roughly 20 miles away from the lake, far beyond where they should have been. and no way near the route my grandma thought she'd taken. My grandfather was the first to reach it. He ran up to the vehicle and opened the door, and as soon as he did, my grandmother fell out of the driver's seat straight into his arms. The first thing she said was, "Oh, thank God you're here," before breaking down and crying. Her watch, which had been a birthday gift less than 6 months earlier, had stopped completely, and the time read 11:15 p.m., which lined up from when the light flashed. Inside the bus, all the kids were deep asleep. When they woke up, none of them had any memory of what happened after the burst of light. Every member of my family who was old enough to remember has told this story over the years. They've drawn what they saw, compared notes, and stuck to the same account their whole lives. None of them have anything to gain from it. In fact, they still get emotional talking about it. And every time I hear this story, I still get chills. This story happened well over 20 years ago in southern Missouri. At the time I was 17 and my friend 16. We had gone out camping and ended up setting up pretty deep into the woods, at least 1.5 miles from our truck, and easily a couple of miles from any kind of civilization or help. We found a small clearing in a dense patch of old-growth forest, and decided that was as good a place as any to set up a tent. The clearing itself wasn't very large, maybe 25 feet across at most, and it was completely surrounded by thick trees and heavy undergrowth. Between our fire and lantern, we could light up the clearing and barely reach the tree line, but beyond that was a solid wall of pitch darkness. It was getting close to midnight and we were winding down, getting ready to go to sleep, when we began hearing movement somewhere beyond the edge of the camp. At first, I tried to brush it off as an animal, but something about it didn't sound right. It didn't have the pattern of a deer, and it didn't sound like coyotes or anything I'd heard before. In fact, the thing I could closely resemble it to was that of a person. We were both armed, but that didn't do much to settle our nerves. There's something about not being able to see what makes the noise that gets you fast. My friend finally called out, "Who's there?" And it was at that moment the movement stopped. Then from one side of the clearing we hear what sounds like monkey noises. It froze both of us in place, and before we could even react, we heard a second call from the opposite side of the clearing. It sounded like an ape or chimpanzee, not anything native to that part of Missouri, and the sound alone was enough to make the hair on the back of our necks stand on end. I looked over at my friend, his eyes wide, and he mouthed, "The hell was that?" We grabbed our flashlights and started sweeping the tree line in an attempt to catch any movement. But the forest was too dense. My friend shouted, "Who's out there?" And that's when we heard the noise again, this time immediately followed by a deafening crack. It sounded like something had just slammed a tree against another. And then it happened again, and again. Each time, this loud noise would echo throughout the woods. We still couldn't see anything. A moment later, we heard another call from the opposite side of the clearing, and this one sounded further away than before, but also slightly repositioned, like whatever was making the sounds had moved while we couldn't track it. We kept sweeping the lights back and forth, expecting to finally catch something, but we never did. After that, we could still hear movement throughout the woods, but it was slowly getting further away, retreating. And finally, everything went quiet. Neither of us slept that night. I've never been able to explain away what I heard. The closest comparison I can make is sort of like an ape or chimpanzee, but even that doesn't feel right after listening to them. And the cracking sound? The closest thing I can compare it to is a baseball bat hitting a tree, but much louder and with greater force. I've shared this story with a couple of people in my lifetime, and a few people have suggested we might have encountered Bigfoot. They've been known to hit big sticks against trees to make that hideous noise, and maybe that's what we heard. Those Bigfoots retreating away. I try not to think about it too often. This happened when I was in college. That was a period in my life where lots of creepy stuff happened to me. I don't really know what I was doing to attract so many weirdos at that time in my life, but I probably should have been evaluating my life choices a little more closely. During college, I worked as a tutor at school, but on the weekends I would sometimes babysit for family friends. One of the kids was actually old enough that he didn't need a babysitter, but he wasn't old enough to watch the younger kids. Thus, my presence on the night that would prove to be honestly terrifying as hell. I don't know. Maybe you won't think it's as bad as I felt like, but we'll see. So, I was babysitting for this family one Saturday night. The parents didn't usually stay out too late, probably getting home around 10 p.m. or even earlier most nights when I babysat for their monthly date night. But this particular night was a special occasion. I can't remember the circumstances of it now. I mean, I was 19, I could stay out past 10 p.m. and they figured they'd be home by 1 a.m. And they said I was welcome to spend the night. But I'd already decided that that would not be happening. That house honestly had a super weird vibe. It was kind of isolated, and they had all these old buildings on the property. A silo, some sheds, a gigantic barn, etc. Perhaps I've watched too many horror movies, but all I could think of was there were so many places for people to hide in those buildings. Plus, the house was really old too, and those always freak me out because, you know, ghosts. So I would not be spending the night there, that was for sure. So I was babysitting the kids, and Kevin wanted me to go help him find something in the basement. He had all of these costumes he used to like to dress up in. Once he scared the absolute hell out of me when he came up from behind me in the dark, wearing an ultra-realistic soldier costume carrying a replica musket that I could have sworn was real, but turned out it wasn't. I nearly lost it that night. The basement was the second creepiest part of the house. The creepiest, of course, being the attic, because I would never go up there, even if they'd have asked me to. It wasn't fully finished, and was really big with lots of corners and turns and hallways and stuff, and a bunch of different rooms. It was actually my first time going beyond the stairway, and I kept thinking, if I had been aware of just how scary this basement was, there was no way in hell I'd be babysitting in this house. But of course I didn't want to look like a wimp in front of a child, so I went with Kevin to his costume area, which was kind of deep in the basement. As we're looking for this costume, we heard a noise that can only be described as footsteps upstairs. At first, I assumed it must be Chris, but then Chris was just suddenly in the doorway, scaring the hell out of me. Seriously, I have no idea where he came from, and he was like, that's not me. I remember this moment vividly. The three of us standing near the closet filled with various costumes of varying creepiness, in this tiny room, in a super sketch basement, listening to what we thought were footsteps upstairs. Well, this is how we die, I thought. But that only lasted a few seconds before I thought, screw that, I'll look around for a weapon. Of course, there was nothing because it was a child's playroom, and the rest of the basement had little within it, apart from like a washer and dryer, which would make a poor weapon unless I could somehow push it onto somebody, which seemed unlikely. In the end, I settled on this random crowbar that was just lying on the floor, and neither kid knew why. And I prepared to meet our fate while considering just how much of a risk I was willing to take to keep these kids safe. It was at this moment that I realized something. The dog wasn't barking. The family had this golden retriever called Lily, who would bark at everything, and she wasn't barking. So I rationalized the sounds as just the noise an old house would make. Plus, I realized when we heard the noises, we weren't actually under the house itself based on the layout of the basement. We were under the porch. So even if there was someone, it wasn't anyone in the actual house. It could have been anyone, a delivery being the most likely explanation, and I felt a lot better, but you bet your ass I kept that crowbar. So the kids and I went upstairs. I went to the porch very cautiously and opened the door to look for possible packages. It was winter and got dark early, meaning it was feasible that a delivery driver would still be working after the sun went down, but of course there was nothing. By this point, I was very stressed out, and the kids were over it. While they were playing video games and I was googling the crime rates in this town, all of a sudden, the dog Lily, who had previously been zoned out, perked up and started barking like a maniac. Then I heard a knock on the door. I could not catch a break this night. Crowbar in hand, I walked to the door, and I could see through the frosted window in the door that someone was standing there, but couldn't make out their features. Since I'm not a total dumbass, I didn't open the door, but did ask through the doorway who it was. The man on the other side of the door said they had a pizza delivery. You already know what I'm about to say. We did not order pizza. This was before every kid had a cell phone, so the boys couldn't have ordered one, and they had been totally dead to the world while they played video games. And if the parents had ordered pizza, they would have told me. So naturally, I again was prepared to fight for my life. I gripped the crowbar and told the guy that we hadn't ordered pizza. I thought for sure he was going to insist and try to get me to open the door, but surprisingly he didn't. He simply said, sorry, my mistake, and left. At this point I had a lot of questions, as one would when facing a series of unusual events in a creepy house in the middle of nowhere. So as I saw the guy walk off the porch through the frosted window, I opened the door slightly. I wanted to see this guy, in case I needed to identify him in a lineup or something eventually. But by the time I opened the door he was walking away, so I only saw his back. But I immediately noticed two strange things. He wasn't carrying any pizzas, and I didn't see his car. The latter I could rationalize because he might have parked on the street, which would have been strange since they had a large horseshoe-shaped driveway, but maybe. But all the same, there was no pizza. I almost called out to him too, in this burst of ill-timed bravery. But then I realized that if I did, he would know the jig was up and would have nothing to lose. So I closed and locked the door. Later that night, Lily was again knocked out, and the kids were upstairs in bed. I didn't think I'd fall asleep. Honest to God, I was sitting there with the crowbar in my hands on high alert, like I was about to be in the fight of my life. In hindsight, it might have been a bit of an overreaction, but I wasn't going to be one of those idiots who dies because they underestimated a threat level. I might as well have suggested the kids and I split up, which of course I realized in that moment that was essentially what had happened. They wouldn't have been much help to me anyway. Well, actually Chris might have been because he was 14 and as tall as I was and could break a board with his fist. Maybe I should have kept him around, but anyway, eventually I did fall asleep for about half an hour, and I was awoken to the sound of an owl. I am a really light sleeper, so either the owl hooting woke me up, or it was just a coincidence. But I heard the owl when I woke up, only it didn't sound right. It sounded owl-ish, almost like an owl, but something was certainly off. As I look back on this now, what I did next was extraordinarily foolish given the events that had transpired that night, but I think my tired brain wasn't working fast enough. That's the real killer in horror movies, exhaustion. In my fatigued state, I decided to investigate. I went to the door and listened. The owl was still hooting, but it still sounded weird. I couldn't figure out why it sounded so off. And this is when I did another stupid thing. I opened the door. With the door open, I could hear the owl a little better, and I looked into the darkness, shining the light on my phone around, and given that this was early 2007, the light left a lot to be desired. Suddenly I heard the owl again, and I honest to God gasped, because this is where all things came together. The hooting didn't sound like an actual owl. It sounded like someone, a human probably, imitating an owl. For real, even recalling it now, this story is giving me chills. Perhaps it doesn't sound like a lot, but it was one of those truly terrifying experiences in my life. The moment where I realized this, my heart was about to pound out of my chest, and I still had the beam of light from my phone pointed into the darkness. And that was when I saw it reflected off a set of eyes that were at the level a human's should be. And remember, this was 2007, so the light was absolutely rubbish, which meant the owner of said eyes were uncomfortably close. Though it was dark, I couldn't make anyone out. I wasn't tired anymore, so I came to my senses, locked the door, barricaded it with a chair, and retreated into the living room after checking all of the downstairs windows again. I grabbed a big knife from the kitchen, and I really contemplated calling the police. But what was I going to tell them? That something outside was making owl noises with eyes? They'd be like, "It's an owl, you moron," and then probably hang up on me. So I sat on the couch again, this time clutching the knife and crowbar, and tried not to think about all the horror stories I had read or seen, especially the ones involving well-meaning babysitters meeting gruesome ends. But I was not successful, and I did not fall asleep again. Around midnight, the couple came home. I had texted them to kind of warn them without sounding like I had completely lost any shred of cool I had left. I just said I thought I heard someone outside, so to be careful when they got home. They were completely unbothered because they lived in some bizarro world where bad things didn't ever happen to good people. They walked in nonchalantly while I put the knife away before they saw me clinging to it, like a shipwreck victim clinging to a piece of floating debris. And this was when they told me that they thought they had heard someone outside a few nights ago as well. Because of course, that isn't something you'd tell your babysitter beforehand. I mean, why would I need to know that? So I took my very well-earned, I swear to Jesus, money, ran to my car, and got the hell out of there. Once I got home, I realized I still had the crowbar, and I won't lie to you, I never brought it back. I mean, because of their critical omission of information, I lived what was very nearly an actual nightmare, so I think I earned the crowbar too. This was the end of my babysitting career. There was only one other time I did babysit for them, and that was during a legit medical emergency one of the parents was having. Everything turned out fine in the end, luckily. I mean, I couldn't turn them down when they called me in desperation, and nothing weird happened that night, thankfully. But I don't think I would have had the mental capacity to deal with this again. But you know, even all these years later, I know one thing with absolute clarity, and that was not an owl. This happened a few years ago now, but it's still bugging me. I was out hiking and rappelling with a friend in the hills near Tombstone. I want to mention that I have spent quite a bit of time solo hiking and camping. I'm used to hearing noises and brushing it off. Anyway, it's late afternoon, and I'm the first one to rappel down. I got to the bottom, and while my partner was getting ready to follow, we heard this noise that I would describe most like a growl/snarl. It sounded like it was coming from the ridge above both of us. If facing the cliff, it sounded like it was coming from the right side. We both looked around but didn't see anything. I encouraged him to come down and even half joked that it was probably just a bear or mountain lion. At that point, I wasn't even feeling that nervous. I figured that once the two of us were together again, we would pretty much be intimidating to an animal. While he rappelled down, I heard a loud crash to what seemed to be parallel to me on my left. By this point, I'm starting to get pretty scared, because it was getting closer and also had somehow gone from right to left on an exposed cliff face without either of us seeing it. He successfully rappelled down, and we both agreed we needed to get the hell out of there, and we still had a steep downhill climb to the car. We packed up the gear as fast as possible, and as we got our backpacks on, we heard what sounded like a howler monkey. The noise was close, and we still could not see what was making it. Of course, it was from the direction we needed to go. We hauled ass down the mountain and got in the car. I know that it can be easy to let the mind play tricks, but we have the exact same account of what happened. Now, this is the part I hesitate to put in writing because I know it sounds even more insane, but we both heard whispering and giggling as if it were right next to us. I keep trying to explain to myself that our minds are just playing tricks on us. The first noise I would chalk up to a bear or mountain lion. Animals are stealthy and could run in front of us without us noticing. Something else could have fallen from the right side. What made the monkey noises though? Why do we both feel like we heard whispering? Does anyone else have creepy experiences in Arizona? I want to believe something was pranking us there, but there weren't any other cars in the parking area. My friend believes that we experienced something supernatural. And honestly, I have no idea what to think. My mum has always had a reputation for being a little haunted. She's had a lot of sightings and experiences throughout her life, and because of that, most of the strange things I've witnessed ended up happening when I was with her. This one stands out more than anything else, and it lasted far longer than something like that should have. At least 45 minutes, closer to an hour, and it happened over 2 decades ago in Southern California. So we were driving back from visiting my sister's family out in the high desert. It was late, and we hadn't made it to the freeway yet when we both noticed something unusual in the sky. There were lights inside the clouds above a nearby Air Force base, but they didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. At first, we tried to explain it away. The lights were colorful, green, red, blue, and white, and they moved and shifted constantly. Sometimes it was one color, other times 2 or 3 blending together. What stood out immediately was that the lights didn't seem to be coming from the ground and projecting upwards. They were fully contained within the clouds themselves. We kept driving expecting to lose sight of them as we put distance between us and the base, but that didn't happen. Even after 40 or more miles, the lights still appeared to be the same distance away from us, as if they were keeping pace. That was the point where it started to feel genuinely unsettling. My mum said she felt like they were following us, and it was hard to argue with that. Logically, we should have left them far behind, especially with the change in elevation as we continued driving. But they stayed with us. The colors kept shifting and blending. The closest comparison I've ever been able to come up with is something like party lights, but that doesn't really do it justice. These were massive. At their biggest, I'd estimate the spread was at least a mile across, maybe more. The size seemed to fluctuate as the lights moved. Eventually, as we got closer to where the city begins, they just stopped being visible. To this day, I still can't explain what we saw. They didn't behave like anything I'd ever heard or read about. I had a pretty creepy encounter once at a national park that still doesn't sit right with me. Me and a few friends were taking a break on the side of a trail, just sitting there and catching our breath. It was a pretty normal moment, nothing unusual going on, until I noticed a middle-aged man stop about 15 feet away from us, right in the middle of the trail. He didn't say anything. He just stood there staring directly at us, smiling, and it wasn't a friendly smile either, just this fixed, unsettling grin. And he didn't break eye contact at all. At first, I remember thinking it was weird, but I tried to brush it off like maybe he was just being awkward or didn't know what to say. Then out of nowhere, he reached down and pulled out a machete. Before any of us could really process what was happening, he started walking straight towards us, picking up speed, still smiling the same way, and still locked into eye contact. That's when everything in my head shifted from confusion to alertness. He came right up to us, close enough that I could have reached out and grabbed him. I was already bracing myself, fully ready to shove him off the side of the trail if he made a wrong move. The drop next to us wasn't small either. It would have seriously hurt him. But instead of swinging or saying anything, he just walked about 2 feet past me like we weren't even there. Then suddenly, he turned and chopped down this tiny bush, maybe a foot tall, like it had done something to him. He didn't say a single word the entire time. After that, he just kept walking down the trail like it was a completely normal interaction. Once he was gone, all of us just sat there, trying to process what we had just witnessed. When we finally started talking about it, every single one of us admitted we had been thinking the same thing, that we might have to push him off the edge to protect ourselves. Looking back, I'm really glad none of us reacted like that because it could have gone very badly very quickly. Still, whatever he was trying to do, whether it was some kind of joke or just unhinged behavior, it almost got him seriously hurt. And whenever we talk of this story, we still refer to him as the Machete Man. I'm an airline pilot, and I have 2 stories to share. The creepiest thing I've ever heard was the distress call of a small general aviation aircraft going down. This was around 2014. He had just blown a cylinder head and oil was shooting all out over his windshield. You could hear the panic in his voice as he radioed out that he couldn't see, and was trying to report his position to a few airliners so that they could relay it to ATC. I checked the news that night, and he actually died in the crash. It was a pretty eerie feeling that we heard the last words of a pilot fighting for his life while we were all cruising above the clouds at 35,000 feet, completely powerless to do anything other than reach out to him over the radio. I've flown to some odd destinations, but one of the creepiest was Ciudad Juarez. Me and 2 flight attendants were boarded on an El Paso layover, so we decided to get drinks at around 11 p.m. We drank until the bars closed at 2, and on the way out we asked the bartender if anything else was still open. "Not unless you want to go to Ciudad Juarez," he joked. I looked at the flight attendants, we shrugged, nodded and said, "Okay." He was shocked that we took him seriously. We walked the short distance back to the hotel, grabbed our passports and set out for Mexico. Before we left, I asked the flight attendants, both women, if they were sure that they were okay with this. And they said yes, as long as we were coming too. Liquid courage efficiently overruled any fears of being kidnapped or beheaded, and off we went. So we walked 20 minutes south to the border. El Paso was completely dead quiet aside from a few homeless people, some of them stumbling around and clearly under the influence of drugs, but none of them bothered us. We reached the Mexican border, and the guards took an extra second to look at these 3 crazy gringos before waving us through. It was close to 3 a.m. at this point, and we were 3 20-something-year-olds wandering around the streets of Ciudad Juarez at night. I'm not sure how much you know about Ciudad Juarez, but it isn't exactly safe at night, especially for non-locals. The streets were pretty empty, and not a single bar was open, but everyone we passed stopped mid-conversation and stared at us as we walked by. At this point, the flight attendants were getting nervous, and were walking so close to me that they were practically brushing up against each other. After determining that everything within a realistic distance of the border was closed, we turned around and headed back to the US. We'd probably been in Ciudad Juarez for about an hour and somehow managed to navigate down the dark and deserted streets onto the same strip that we entered on. By this point we were close enough to the border that there were a few street lights that were still on. All of a sudden, 2 locals stumbled out from the dark sidewalks into the street, which we were just walking down the middle of. As they came into the light, all 3 of us jumped at what we saw. A man and a woman, both with scarred faces, hunched backs, excessive sweat and ripped clothes and missing teeth, were grinning as they approached us. The man was half speaking Spanish and half laughing. The startle factor of their approach combined with their appearance stands out as one of the biggest jump scares of my life. After realizing they weren't trying to kill us yet, I figured screw it, we'd come this far, why not throw a Hail Mary? And to my own disbelief, I actually tried to communicate with the man and ask if he knew of any bars that were open. By this point, the flight attendants were so terrified that each one had latched themselves onto one of my arms. In any situation other than this one, I'd have looked pretty cool. The man simply pointed behind him and said, "Order ya," over there. There was a motel with all the lights turned off except for a steady red light on the front balcony and a flickering light from inside a room on the second floor. One of the flight attendants turned to me and said, "N.O. We need to leave now." I thanked the man and woman for their time, and we hightailed it to the US border. They gave us a thorough questioning, and rightfully so, as one man and two women crossing into the US around 4 a.m. reeks of human trafficking. Weirdly, the number of people huddled on the streets of El Paso had doubled, and we sped-walked back to our hotel. That layover for me definitely takes the cake for creepiest thing to happen in the middle of nowhere. When I was around 10, I was playing on the front porch with my cousins at his house. He lived way out in the country. It was one of those places where you're like 10 to 15 minutes from the nearest store, and it's all gravel and dirt roads. It's exceptionally quiet, and there aren't that many people around. Well, all of a sudden, this car pulls up in front of the house, and this man gets out. And I'll never forget what he was wearing. It was like full-on spy gear, a trench coat, sunglasses, a hat pulled low, and he was holding this huge professional camera, like the kind paparazzi use. He didn't say anything. He just began taking pictures of us, and because I was a super extroverted kid, I thought it was funny or cool at first. I was like, "Let's pose for him." So me and my cousin actually started doing little poses, not really realizing how creepy this thing was. Then my uncle came outside and started yelling, and the guy immediately jumped back into his car and sped off and just disappeared, and we never saw him again. At the time, it felt weird, but of course we never fully understood the situation, and now as an adult, I look back and it gives me chills. He was clearly hiding his identity. And being out in the middle of nowhere with a big camera taking pictures of kids is still so suspect. We still talk about it sometimes, and I can't help but wonder what he was really doing there. Maybe he was just scoping out the talent to see who he was going to traffic. To anyone who has ever lived in their van, they might be able to relate to this story, as it happened during a sleep when I started van life. So I was at the point in my van life where I didn't even have curtains set up yet, and I woke up in the middle of the night. There was a woman standing right outside my window staring directly at me. She was extremely dark, unnaturally black, almost blending into the night itself, except that I could still see her face and hands pressed against the glass. The moment I moved and she realized I was awake, she began laughing. Not an ordinary laugh either. It was a loud, drawn-out laugh, and honestly the most evil-sounding laugh I think I've ever heard in my life. Then she just skipped away into the darkness like it was nothing. That laugh stuck with me in a way I can't really describe. I wonder if she was a phantom of some kind. The other time happened when I was working a seasonal job at a cemetery in Seattle. I would usually park my van right outside the cemetery before work, so I didn't have to commute in the morning. It was pretty cold out there, so I'd sleep buried under a heavy sleeping bag with extra blankets on top. And one night I woke up and realized something was amiss, because when I looked up towards the front of the van, there was a man sitting in the front seat, and he was just casually shooting up. I had no idea how he even got there. I didn't hear a single thing while it happened, and as soon as I pushed my head out from under the covers and he noticed me, he completely lost it. He started screaming, grabbed my bag, and bolted out of the van as fast as he could. I was so out of it, still half asleep and trying to process what happened. that I didn't react right away. The situation was so bizarre I think I scared him more than he scared me, once he realized I was actually there at any rate. I'm from a small town in coastal British Columbia, and seeing as it's small, most people pretty much know everyone else, and it's genuinely considered as quite a trusting place. Well, one summer night a friend of mine and I went down to a well-known beach spot to relax and watch the stars. It was late enough that the beach was mostly empty, except for one other person, a middle-aged white guy, who had set himself up right near the entrance. He had this whole little thing going on, like a small log fort, and resting on one of the logs was a red lantern casting a dim glow around him. It didn't seem that creepy at first, just kind of eccentric, and as we walked past him, we gave a quick, polite nod and hello, and he greeted us back normally enough. As we kept walking, he casually asked if we wanted to join him. Now, in a small town like ours, this kind of thing isn't completely unheard of, so it immediately didn't raise any alarm bells, but we politely declined and keep moving as we wanted our own space. As we walked away, he said, "No worries, hope you guys have a nice night." But there was something about the way he said it. It had an odd, almost ominous tone, but we tried to brush it off as just some guy who might have had a few drinks. We ended up much further down the beach, well out of sight from where we first saw him. We laid out a blanket, talking quietly, and were looking up at the stars. After a while, though, we heard some twigs snap in the forest behind the shoreline. It made us pause for a second. We both quickly dismissed it as deer, as our town is full of them, and that wouldn't have been unusual at all. We stayed for maybe another 15 minutes when suddenly we heard something that absolutely did not belong there. A phone notification going off from an Android phone, coming from the trees behind us. We both froze. Bear in mind there are no houses or roads or any reason for anyone to be back in that part, especially not at that hour. The only other person we'd seen the entire night was that old man back at the beach entrance. I felt myself lock up. Thankfully, my friend snapped into action, and she told me that we should probably leave fast. Instead of going back through the forest trail we originally came from, she made the call to walk along the open beach where we could actually see what was around us. We packed up quickly and started moving, trying not to panic, but definitely not wasting any time either. When we got back to the entrance, the man was gone, but his stuff wasn't. The red lantern was still sitting there, and his guitar had been left behind exactly where we'd first seen it. So that's what happened. He had followed us into the trees and was watching us in the dark. Whether he was just some creep looking to spy on a couple of girls, or someone with worse intentions, I didn't even want to guess. The only reason he was caught is because he made the mistake of leaving his phone on loud, and that sound gave him away. This is my brother's story. My story begins in Ireland of 1965, just before the Northern Irish Troubles started. My two brothers, Gary and Ed, were in their teens and decided to cycle from Belfast to our auntie's place in Drogheda, just outside of Dublin. A fair ride on a bike, take that from me. Along the way, they would make turns in asking for directions, sometimes get a glass of water or milk or even a sandwich. Anyway, it was Gary's turn to ask for directions when they came to this long driveway. On both sides of the driveway as you're going in were private hedges and an old stone wall. The driveway itself was pitted and looked as if no one had driven up it in yonks. Gary left his bike with Ed and made his way up the driveway, which wound through some overhanging trees until the farmhouse came into view. Now, this farmhouse, so Gary told me years later, was your typical rural Irish cottage with a thatch roof, peeling whitewashed stone walls, and a large old barn not far from the house. Then he saw these cats coming out of the barn, not just 2 or 3, but hundreds upon hundreds of the moggies, all different colours, shapes and sizes spilling out into the yard, meowing and rubbing themselves against his leg as he approached the house. "Jesus," he muttered. "What's with these cats?" He went in and knocked on the door and received no answer. He knocked, this time louder, and still got none. So he walked up to the window, pushing through the swarm of cats, and peered in. There, he told me, were these cats, maybe 40 of them, all peering down into a hole in the floor, and then they turned to look at him. Gary said he'd never run so fast in his life, tearing down the road with the cats all meowing at him and some even chasing him and screaming for Ed to come. Ed was already halfway down the road cycling like hell. When they got to Belfast a few weeks later, Gary told my granny, "Oh boy, do we have some great ghost stories for you, Granny, about this house." She looked at him and told him what he'd witnessed was the infamous House of Cats, also known as the Whispering Willows Farm. Kid you not, that was the name I've heard, and that it is said to only emerge every 50 years. Thanksgiving week of 2010. My parents and I were headed to Virginia to visit my grandma and a big chunk of our family for Thanksgiving. It was chilly out, but not chilly enough to stop 9-year-old me from overheating and getting sick about 3/4 of the way through the trip. We were somewhere in West Virginia, and there were no exits for about an hour or so, and there was nowhere safe to pull over and step out for a few more miles. We were completely in the middle of nowhere, and it must have been around 2 in the morning. And I declared to my mum, "I'm gonna throw up." My mum searched around for probably 45 seconds straight and couldn't find anything for me to puke in. This is the first and only time I have ever thrown up in a pillowcase. After about 10 minutes, we pulled over onto a small, one-vehicle rest area directly next to the farthest right lane, and my mum took me to the railing so that I could once again throw up. When that was over, we went to the trunk of the car where my mum dug around for paper towels and a bag to put the pillowcase in. She found paper towels and wiped my face. While she continued her search for a bag, there was a slight rustling coming from behind us near the woods. "Do you girls need some help?" We both stopped what we were doing and briefly turned around to see that a large, bald man, probably in his late 40s, had come from the woods on a bicycle. He had absolutely nothing with him, not even a jacket. My mum immediately slammed the trunk and grabbed me. She threw me in the back seat and jumped in the front and yelled, "Go!" to my dad. What the hell was that? Was that a person? My mum explained to him what happened, and to this day the question we've always had is, where the hell did he come from? It's just strange to me that anyone would be riding their bike at 2 a.m. in 40-degree weather in only a t-shirt for at least 20 miles. Do I think he had ill intentions? I don't know. But what the hell was he doing out there at that time? About 3 years ago, we rented a cabin in the Boone area that had these incredible long-range views over the valley. It was an isolated place where you could see the sky clearly without much light pollution, especially at night. Well, one evening right around midnight, I had an experience that lasted maybe 10 minutes, but has stuck with me ever since. I noticed a light out over the valley that at first looked like a normal star. After a few seconds, I started thinking maybe it was a satellite because it was moving slowly across the sky. But then it did something that no longer made me think that, because instead of continuing in a straight, steady line as a satellite would, it suddenly changed direction and started zigzagging. It was shifting back and forth while staying in the same general area. That's when I knew that I was not looking at anything ordinary. I called my son outside so that he could see it too, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't just imagining things. And this is where it got really strange. I truly believe, and I'll stand by this for the rest of my life, that whatever that light was became aware of me watching it. The moment I focused on it and pointed it out, it stopped moving altogether. Then slowly, it began to move in my direction. It kept coming until it was directly above me, just hovering there, and I remember standing there looking straight up at it in defiance, trying to process what I was seeing and how that even made sense. Then, it just shot straight up into the sky and disappeared instantly. I actually posted a video of it a while back, but honestly it's terrible and doesn't prove anything. It just looks like a distant light moving around, nor does it capture how precise or unnatural the movement really was. The only thing it really shows is that I've been telling the same story for the past 3 years. In my opinion, it was something similar to what pilots have been reporting, something that doesn't follow the normal rules of physics. The way it changed direction and accelerated didn't match anything I've ever seen before. I'll definitely be keeping an eye on the sky again this summer, because whatever it was, I've never forgotten it. I've had a few strange sightings in my time. I'm an avid stargazer with my own telescope and an aviation enthusiast. When I was around 10, my house had an open view of the Pacific Ocean in California. I was looking at the stars one night and saw what looked like a dogfight in space. Little stars doing maneuvers and blaster bolts going between them. I could have been tired and seeing things, but I still remember it. There was another time when I was in Arizona outside talking over the phone when I noticed a shooting star, which I thought was very cool. It vanished after a second, then reappeared and did a 90-degree turn. Another time in Arizona, it was a Halloween party, and a group of us were on the roof chilling. I noticed and pointed out a blue meteor streaking across the sky, leaving a trail. Except it was way too slow to be a meteor, almost as fast as a satellite, and the trail went across most of the sky. Another time my friend and I were driving south on the 5 in California after a little social gathering, and we saw a craft just hovering over an overpass. He was driving and his car had a sunroof, so we opened and I checked it out. Its profile was like a wedge. Underneath it was a triangle of 3 lights at each point. No sound, and it stayed until I got out of my range of vision. It was probably 15 feet or so long and 6-ish wide. There was another time I was out in California when I saw a shooting star, and when it vanished I saw the meteorite flying for a few seconds. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories, and if of course you did, you can let me know down below. I do enjoy reading your comments and thoughts. This was a fun one. I loved these stories, and if you have a topic you'd like for the future, be sure to let me know. I actually have some free content dropping tomorrow on Patreon. You can check that out at around 7 p.m. What is it, like CST, I think? And it'll be there. I'll probably do a YouTube post so you can see it. It's all free stuff, by the way. Good, interesting stories. Speaking of which, I would like to give one final thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Your support truly does mean a hell of a lot to me and goes an awful long way in keeping everything running over here at Mortis Media, so thank you all. With that, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome. See you again soon, and good night.